Welcome to Carbon Politics, a CSE podcast series decoding the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. In this series, we will explore multiple critical questions that are surrounding and pressuring the climate debate today. What happens next on multilateralism, or where is the current trade system going? And how does the global financial architecture need to be reformed? How are these systems influencing the ability of developing countries to address, respond to, and adapt to climate change? These are some of the critical questions we hope to answer, and we hope you join us on this journey this year. Hi everyone, welcome to Carbon Politics, CSE's video podcast which discusses the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. I'm Avantika Goswami from CSE's Climate Change Program, and we have a very exciting episode planned today. So before I get into explaining and introducing our very illustrious speakers today, I'm going to talk about a very brief quote from this book. It's called Conflicts of Interest. It's a 2017 publication authored by Sunita Narain. Climate negotiations are not just about cutting emissions, but also about negotiating the right to development. This is an excerpt from this book, and it's also the core of CSE's politics and engagement in the multilateral UN climate process. So why is this important? This year we are observing 33 years of climate negotiations since the establishment of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Also quoting this book, the UNFCCC was historic because it recognized the historical responsibility in creating the problem and called on those countries to act first and fast to reduce emissions that contribute to climate change. So the UNFCCC is perhaps the most decisive climate treaty. It enshrines the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. It emphasizes and urges the need for coordinated global action on climate change. And very importantly, it writes in considerations of financial support and spillover effects on trade for developing countries. All of this was done in 1992, more than 30 years ago. 3 decades since, the UNFCCC endures despite very turbulent political cycles, dilution from industry influence, and also a changing nature of Global South economies, because in the past 30 years we have seen massive changes in poverty eradication, growth, prosperity. The Global South has also been a shape-shifting kind of entity. But this climate regime today is under immense strain, and this is why we are in need of fresh ideas. I think history is very instructive, and which is why I want to intentionally go back today to where it all began. So I have with me two very special speakers, Sunita Narain, CSE's Director General, and Anumita Roychowdhury, CSE's Executive Director. And other than being leaders in the field of environmental and climate research and advocacy, they don't need an introduction. Both of them were also at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, along with Anil Agarwal, CSE's founder. So usually I have the privilege of just being your colleague, but today I also want to be a student of climate governance and really ask you how this ambitious treaty came about. So Anumita, I'll start with you. If you can kick us off and tell us how the Rio Convention came together. And can you also describe the moment, the mood, how difficult it was to align different interests? So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Avantika, for this question. For to take us back to 1992, the memory is fading, but we still have to reconstruct, keeping in mind that there's so many relevant messages that are so relevant even today. So when we landed in Rio, with Sunita and I and Anilji, first the excitement, and then the expectations. For the first time, you are creating a multilateral process to address climate change, the most serious survival crisis, and putting it on the top global political agenda. That was the whole excitement about. So imagine then 125 countries, then 12,000 people, 100 head of the states, right? You can imagine the attention that this issue got. But very important that today, when we often get so disheartened by the COP after COP and what's happening and their outcome, what Rio really gave us, when we look back, what exactly said, the key guiding principles to lay the foundational principles to drive and guide climate negotiation. Right. So first, the Rio Declaration that integrated the CBDR principle. It established that the states have the sovereign rights on resources. Right. It talked about sustainable consumption. It actually talked about not using trade rules arbitrarily and in a discriminatory manner. Yeah. Right? So all these were said then, and that laid down the foundation. Mm-hmm. But more important, of course, at that point of time, a lot of things got discussed. But some important lessons that we want to draw is that in that first convention, the impressive role that the Global South had played. Okay?
So important. Yeah.
And I want to give 3 examples. Mm-hmm. One, at that point of time, clearly the North, because they did not want to take on ambitious emission reduction targets. Yeah. They wanted all these diversionary tactics. Okay? They wanted to have a legally binding forest convention imposed on everyone. Right? And which means that you're controlling and policing the world's forest resources. Mm-hmm. Now, clearly that meant for the Global South and for all of us, and India played a very significant role there. And we had played the role to mobilize to ensure that that convention does not happen. So you remember, Sunita, the late night negotiations, and Anilji was then in that also the delegation, and all of that, and finally we could kill it, and we got that replaced with own principles, right? But also understand the way they play around, like the Africans wanted desertification treaty, and the US and others, they wanted to hold that as a carrot to them to get their support for the convention, the forest convention. But good thing is that they got the desertification treaty. We also could kill the forest convention. We could also get the biodiversity convention even when US did not want it because they wanted to protect their biotechnology industry.
Wow.
Right? Okay. So that's the thing that we really want to keep in mind going forward, that if Global South could do that once, there is no reason why we cannot have a common position to get a much better deal in the future.
Wow, so interesting and so instructive in so many ways. So this chess game actually that many of us newly working now in climate policy, we get frustrated so easily with. I mean, it's been there from the beginning. So I think I'll come to you, Sunita. Who were some of the key actors that, who were the big power players in Rio, ensuring maybe failure, success, good and bad? What roles did they play?
So in some senses, Anumita has taken me back to that moment when we landed in Rio, and there was, as she said, there was at one level this enormous excitement about, the way we are going to save the world, and there was optimism. There was, I call it the age of innocence, but there was also the chess play, as she has very clearly said, and the players then have remained the players today. And I think where we need to understand is that we need to make sure that we find a way ahead, because we know that the gameplay is, the chess game is all about vested interests. Yeah. So the one big issue was climate in Rio. Yeah. Now, when we went into the climate negotiations in Rio, there were 3 or 4 major players. On one hand, they were the Europeans, who were arguing that they wanted an ambitious climate agreement. Yeah. But interestingly, as Europe has often done, by the time they reached Rio, they had already whittled down their expectations. In fact, if I remember right, they had fired, or the leading voice in Rio, their climate negotiator, was sacked because there was a lot of US pressure. So whereas the Europeans wanted hard targets and ambitious targets, by the time they got to Rio, it was, let's have a deal even if we don't have targets, okay? The Americans were, of course, the major opposer to the climate convention. Then and now, exactly. But it was also the moment, which in some senses is the moment today, and we need to remember it. This was the time of Bush Senior, George Bush Senior. It was also a time when America wanted, they had an economic recession, and the very image in Rio was George Bush Senior going through the supermarket aisles and asking Americans to consume. Because the message was the more you consume, the more America will grow. Yeah. And that was really the counter to what you would argue would be climate responsible governance. But the Americans were pretty clear that they would not take any supranational agreement which would put curbs on their national growth. They would not take on any targets. The third part was, of course, the vulnerable countries. At that time, AOSIS, not the small island nations were there, but not so strong. But the real strength actually was India, China, and the G77, which was there in Rio not to deny climate change. Yeah. We were not naysayers. We were not saying that climate change was not important or urgent, but we were demanding that there needed to be rules for climate which took into account that the atmosphere was the world's largest commons. Yeah. And that was the position put on the table to say, we need equity, we need climate justice, not because we don't want to take action, but because we need rules of fairness, because only then will you have cooperation in the world. Yeah. And I think that role that the countries of the South played at that time, which of course got a lot of bad press, because remember, these positions are not very convenient for either no Western power. Yeah. So this is often seen as, oh, they're regressive, they're denying climate change. But what actually you got out of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, yes, you didn't get the targets. Those targets were then at the Kyoto Protocol. But what you did get was an element of fairness built in, which said that there is a group of countries which has created the problem. They need to be the first movers. It did not say they needed to be the only movers. They needed to be the first movers. Okay? They would reduce emissions. They would vacate space so that the remaining part of the world could grow and develop, but that the remaining part of the world would grow and develop differently. They would be enablers of technology and finance so that these countries would grow differently, would grow without pollution. Now, if you were to rewrite today, you could not do better. But the fact is, the last 30 odd years, the world has spent all its time trying to dilute, erase, remove the principles of equity which were enshrined at Rio. And we are suffering today as a global community because we have done so.
Right. Absolutely. And it really seems like the principles that were developed at Rio and written into the convention, for a change, actually, it was rules that the Global South had a role in shaping and actually, if abided by, could have advanced our best interests. You're not seeing that in the rest of the world. Everywhere else, in trade, in finance, in every other realm, the rules of global systems are written by the Global North. They're also broken by the Global North, as we are seeing today with all of the trade wars and everything that's happening. So I'm going to actually skip ahead to a question I have around what did we get right and what more could we have done, because it seems like I know at that time CSC had argued that this was not an ambitious outcome, as you both have told me, but then now it just seems like, oh my goodness, we've only gone downhill from there. What do you think in this governance architecture, what did we get right and what could we have done better to ensure the next 30 years may have looked a little different?
So, I believe we got the principles of equity right. And all global negotiations need to be built on a foundation of trust. And trust comes when there is a voice and there is a dialogue and there is a principled position the world takes. It's not transactional. Okay? It's not you give me apples and I will give you oranges, okay? And if you don't give me your apples, I will put a tariff on you, okay? Or if you put a price on your apples, then I won't buy them. These are trade rules, okay? But climate rules and environmental rules require cooperation. Cooperation comes out of building principled positions. And I think Rio really did embed principles. If you look at biodiversity, the question in biodiversity was the question of access of the poor communities to the knowledge that they had, the rights that they would hold to that knowledge, the benefits that would accrue to them, so that the pharma industry wouldn't just come and do biopiracy, but that they would benefit from it. There was a principle established. Climate was a principle established. And I think, to me, I'm missing in future negotiations. I think the building blocks that we had in Rio of principles is what we have lost over time. Would you agree with that, Anumita?
Absolutely, and I think that exactly is the point, that the principles but the building blocks that were needed. Okay, we could not create the right framework to actually crystallize and institutionalize that process over a period of time. So now, when the cracks and fissures are showing up, that because for various reasons, the whole economic downturn, and as a result of that, the barriers and the protectionism that is showing up now. So clearly, what is showing that the principles could not find could not be grounded in the proper institutional global framework that was needed to make it sustainable and drive the institutional process to deliver on these principles.
Anumita, just slight difference, not slight difference, but in elaboration of what you're saying, that, if you look at it from Rio, we went to the Berlin mandate. Till then, the world stood firm, and maybe it was the time, you had the wall coming down, you had a moment when the world was celebrating a sense of, a victory of togetherness, a sense of optimism. I think in some senses and I do feel that we are all part of this, and we've all in some senses been party to this downfall. I think the fact is, since the Berlin Mandate in the mid-90s to after that, it became more commerce. And it became more in terms of, countries essentially not being able to hold on to the principles that they themselves believed in. Or maybe they did not believe in those principles, okay? Principles of justice, principles of equity, principles of sharing the resources of this one earth, that they didn't really believe in it. And so the bureaucrats took over, the negotiators took over, and then all of it was about a comma and a full stop, and you take this and I take this. And then, of course, you had at the same time, you had the trade negotiations happening.
Exactly.
WTO, which had already been born, free trade was flowing, China joined, emissions did not come down in the West, manufacturing moved, China grew, and the world just essentially lost the plot.
So when it was losing the plot, something that we were not very conscious of noticing is the whole power shift happening, the power equation changing in that multilateral framework.
In what way?
So in the traditional way, when we always talked about North versus South, North was always US and Europe for us, right? But we never understood the gravity and the implication of the power shift from that geopolitics to the Asia and China. You know, it's a different kind of polarization, and multipolar changes were taking place because of the big shifts in the market manufacturing across the world. And the Rio process could not respond to that adequately.
But it wasn't Rio's fault. It was Paris's fault.
Yeah, that's true.
Because in some senses, when the world came up with the Paris Accord, they rewrote the principles of Rio. And they said now every country will do what it can. Now, in Rio, if you look at all international negotiations, they built on a principle of saying, okay, this is Annex 1 countries, the countries which were the first contributors, they need to reduce. If you have a rule-based system, then you would actually have rules even for a country like China to move from being a low polluter to a high polluter, move from this side of the table to this side of the table. But because you actually removed the rules, you now have a situation in which you have a completely free-for-all situation, and in which you can't really have a world in which any conditions apply. And then you get a president of the most powerful nation of the world who comes and says, I don't even believe in climate change. And it's like a deck of cards. And they've just collapsed.
So the rules, that framework just will not be created.
So, I think it's the question of principles is so important. I think complementary to that, I also just want to highlight again, emphasizing how important Rio was. To anybody listening, it was not just a kind of fluff document. There were provisions for finance. There were inclusion of questions of trade. There were questions around how countries whose economies are dependent on income generated from fossil fuels will be addressed. So there were a lot of very real economy considerations built in along with those principles and the moral obligation. So what does that say? I don't have a clear question, but I have a clear direction that I'm trying to go in. What does that say about that moment and what happened after that? Why were we not able to kind of translate it into a real economy application? Because you've also said in your book, the UN negotiations are not just about environment, they are intensely economic negotiations. It makes perfect sense. You want to decarbonize, you have to restructure your entire economy. That doesn't happen overnight. So I guess, what happened in that missing link? Why were we not able to get these real economy shifts to happen? And of course, Paris just diluted all of that. But yeah.
But this is beyond the Paris question. Anumita.
Yeah, so this is also not exactly a Rio question
either.
No,
it's really a development question.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about how we see environmental management and development. And if you look at it, Anumita's entire work on air pollution and looking for the co-benefits is really what should have been the discussions.
Absolutely.
And we should have been able to hold to that. So,
but we are seeing something very interesting now. Now when we are talking about multilateralism and the new context of this, it is also becoming very clear that what you're saying, the economic, actually the finding the solutions, we are today looking for more contextualized solutions in a regional context.
Right.
And we are talking about a bottom-up terms to be set. Right? So at one level, it is the bottom-up, more country, region-driven, their own solutions, but this will have to be supported by a global policy and finance architecture.
Absolutely.
So how do you make the two match? So therefore, for the first time, I think we are becoming more conscious of the development dynamics and especially in the global south.
Absolutely.
That's the critical issue that we need to address.
Anumita really hit the nail on the head. This is the difference today. And if we can take this and celebrate this, we then have a way ahead, Avantika, because I know you want to move towards what do we do now. And to me, one of the most, we both are telling you that the South played a big role in Rio. But the South did not own the agenda. Okay? We did not own it. We did not feel confident about it. We still saw the environmental agenda as a threat as conditionalities coming from the north to us.
Exactly.
We were not, and for us it was all about environment versus development. Okay? Because that's the way it has been framed all over the world.
Yeah.
Okay? Today, I think the South is beginning to have an agenda of its own, which is quite distinctly different. I mean, when we talk about electric, you talk about transport as a major contributor to climate change. In the Western world, they talk about electric cars. Okay? We talk about mobility, transformation. We talk about the efforts to be able to move people, not vehicles. Now, by doing that, you're actually making sure that the rare minerals in the world, which are scarce, which also require mining, which are also conflict-driven, will be used much more prudently. Okay? Will be much more efficiently managed. So if the South can own the agenda, which is really what Anumita is saying today, then we really have a new way ahead. Because for us, the agenda cannot be anti-development. The agenda on environment has to be development. We cannot say, get rid of coal. We are going to have to say, why not coal? Because you need air pollution benefits, but what will you do for energy security? That has to be the centerpiece of the South. And we will find new pathways maybe, and that may be a turning point. Would you not agree with that?
Totally, totally. And that's why perhaps the conversation is becoming more real today, because we are now, earlier we only said South requires fund. So you give us fund, and that 100 billion became a prefix that always. But now look the maturity in the finance conversation. Okay, for the first time now we are saying development in the global South connected with their debt burden, connected with the cost of investment, connected with all the distortionary policies globally, MDB policies. Now this means that now we're really talking about an agenda totally driven by the local imperatives of different regions. Right? And that's where now, so the whole so therefore, how do you match that? It's just not about giving the fund. It is also about helping the global South to reduce their cost of transition.
Right. And enabling that structural transformation
and not thinking that there will be no cost to transition. Because that was the message we were always told. For so many years we have been told, why don't you go solar? Why don't you do it differently? You should learn from our lessons. Today the global North itself is learning that there is a cost to transition. That there is a growth of the right-wing parties which are opposing the environmental agenda of the global North. Okay? We, in our part of the world, have to have an agenda which is different. And I think that's really, to me, where we need to amplify this. In some level, you know, Avantika, you've got us all thinking about this. And when I think about it, why did we go so wrong for 30 years? In some senses, the inequality in the structures, you know, where we couldn't get the messages out from our world strong enough, loud enough, so that we could actually be on the table having a different point of view. I'm still not sure whether we have that, but that really will be required if you want a new tapestry. Otherwise, you have just, you know, a mono frame, a monochromatic world, which you can never really build.
No, this is incredibly compelling in terms of thinking of bottom-up development strategies, and I feel like these are things CSE and CSE's research has always advocated for. But having the Global South drive the agenda, uplifting local imperatives, contextualized solutions. But then I think I have a useful segue here to my next question, which is there is a cost to all of this. And sure, we are doing much of the transition ourselves, but do we just completely let go of the questions of international cooperation? I'm using a bad word, reparations, the obligation to pay. So I guess that brings me to this question of equity. So what does equity look like today in today's context versus the principle that was enshrined in the UNFCCC? And you two are best positioned to actually answer this question, I feel.
Anumita.
So today, so far, we have been focusing that yes, we need equity as a principle to guide, to drive. But today, I think what is very critical is to really understand what operationalizing equity means. We still don't really quite understand that. One is at that macro level, we say that just and fair sharing of the carbon space. But that is the framing for it. But how do you do that, right? So therefore, how do you build equity as a defining parameter in all your trade policies, in all your funding policies, financing strategies, and the strategy development that we do to ensure that equity is everywhere in terms of access to capital, access to market, access to raw material, to be part of the supply chain with an equitable presence. It has to get defined, therefore, across all sectors, parameters, and financing strategies. So it's still very fuzzy in my mind, but it is that operational framework that has to become much clearer today to make the multilateralism work and the collaboration, cooperation work in the right direction.
The fact is, Avantika, if I can just elaborate further on what Anumita said, and I agree with her completely. The first thing is equity is today an imperative. It's even more than even Rio.
Absolutely.
The reason is very clearly we have run out of the carbon space. We have 70% of the world which still requires the right to development. And as they develop, they will add emissions to the same atmosphere, which will add to temperatures. And we know that climate change is a great leveler. If we've had this horrific incident in the Himalayas where we've had cloudbursts and massive losses of life, you have the same issue happening across the world where you're seeing intensification of weird weather events in the global north, also taking lives and property. So it's a great leveler. But I think there are two things that as we rebuild the conversation based on equity. One, we need to make sure that it's not as simple as equity in climate, exactly as Anumita has said. We need to take the trade issue very much along with it. And for that, you're really talking about what then is the basis for development of the global south. Okay? Because if the global south is only within an export-driven commodity sale system, it will discount its environment. Okay? It will discount its forests. It will discount its land. So you need to be able to talk about the development futures of not just the global south, but also the global north. And in some senses, this turbulence that is in the world today, which President Trump has brought about because of his his completely disruptive, turbulent approach, maybe from that there should be a conversation to say, let's rewrite the trade rules.
Something new.
And let's rewrite the rules for environmentalism so that it's not just about handing more money, that also in the name of climate when you give more loans and add to the debt burden of countries. But you're actually giving enabling tools in these countries so that they can develop differently. And I think that to me is where really the soul of Rio, to go back to your point, the soul of Rio, the voice of Rio of 1992 will really find a freshness in today.
Right. The old world is dying and the new is yet to be born. So this is a time of monsters, but it could be a time of actually something constructive. I will take just one more question because we are almost at the end of our time, but this is one of my absolutely pressing questions to both of you. You mentioned that the Global South was very instrumental in making Rio happen. Pros and cons. What about Global South solidarity today to actually push for a new equitable green regime? And it doesn't have to be, narrowed down to just like BRICS or, other kind of countries. Just generally thinking across developing countries, we are quite fractured. Is there a way that you see this agenda being pushed by Global South countries coherently? How do we build that solidarity? And I go back to the question of, I have a note here about the Bandung conference of the post-colonial era, where Global South leaders of newly freed countries came together in a decolonial moment. Can we see something like that for climate and development, or is that me being too naive and hopeful? Would love your thoughts.
So, if I can take a first jab at this, Anumita, I think it's a very strange time in our world. It's a surreal time in our world right now. On one hand, countries are being driven to go into a self-protection mode. Okay, I've never seen this as much as now. We don't think as one, because everyone is being forced to think about me. How do I protect myself? How do I protect my economy, my car manufacturers, my steel and aluminium industry, my. So in some sense, it's not we, it's my. Yeah. On the other hand, there is this strange disruptive approach of Trump may also push new alliances. Yeah. Okay? Because countries may just come together and say, because if there is so much threat against the my approach, maybe we can only operate as a group together. Yeah. And that group together will be based on the neo-localization of our economy, not on just the globalization of our economy, but the localization of our economy, reinvesting in our economic growth at the very local level, so that you build resilience, you build livelihoods, you build sustainability, and that's the way to counter this broken globalized world where it's not about anything to do with principles anymore. I don't know. I'm thinking on my feet right now, but it just seems...
In fact, that is a very important link, that new localization. That's what Sunita is saying. And keep in mind that today the development trajectory is going to pace up in Global South a lot faster. And that means new opportunities, new alliances on technology. And if that becomes green technology oriented, that means you are creating a new market pulse in the Global South. Right? Now, we understand even Global South is not a homogeneous community. They also have their conflicting interests. But still, there's a lot of scope for alignment, and our work in Africa and Asia shows so clearly that Global South will think differently. They will innovate differently. It's not going to be the same way that the Global North has worked. Because our compulsions are very different. We have to find new innovative ways of going around our development path, dealing with our poverty, dealing with our low-income trajectory. So now that is a huge opportunity. So the new alliance, and so if this new growth can be connected with the green technology, green energy, clean energy, and so forth, that means the new growth in the future, and despite Trump's disruption, you can actually, offset him. It's possible if we have a strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to wrap up this incredible conversation, but I have learned so much as always. So we are looking at actually a much less bleak picture, actually. I think what your insights have taught me is that we're in a turbulent moment, but we could actually grasp this, use our own agency, and it could be a time to rewrite the rules, as you have said. It could be a time for new alliances based on green technologies, cooperation, leapfrogging high carbon growth paths. And is the UNFCCC equipped to handle all of that? That's a conversation we'll keep having, but of course the space that the UNFCCC offers for multilateralism, for voices of Global South countries, that continues to remain extremely important. The world around it is changing, so we have to keep talking about how the UNFCCC can keep adapting and responding. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, and that's it for today's episode. Please join us for the remaining episodes this year. Thank you.